October 1944. Peenemünde, Baltic Coast. Lightning flashed over a line of concrete hangars as scientists in black coats scrambled beneath the storm. Inside one building stood a barrel longer than a city bus, painted with the code Project Eisenfaust, Iron Fist. The Schutzstaffel had promised it would be Hitler's final miracle, a cannon that could fire a projectile faster than sound without using a single gram of gunpowder. A young engineer named Kurt Weisner stared at the gleaming chamber, veins of electricity crawling across its coils. When the order came, activate Phase 1. He hesitated only a moment. He didn't yet know that this test, meant to save the Reich, would instead destroy the last of its faith in science. Before we start, where are you watching from? Comment below, and if you believe forgotten inventions can change history, hit subscribe. By 1944, Germany's war machine was collapsing under its own weight. Allied bombers owned the skies, the Eastern Front was burning, and Hitler's so-called Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapons, had failed to deliver miracles. The V-1 buzz bomb frightened civilians, but changed nothing. The V-2 rocket was magnificent on paper, but each launch cost more lives and fuel than the damage it inflicted. The massive Gustav gun could hurl a 7-ton shell, yet it took days to move, hours to reload, and weeks to repair. The Reich was bleeding, desperate for a single strike that could reverse its fate. That desperation drew the attention of Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, the SS engineer administrator now overseeing the Third Reich's most secret programs. He had built underground factories, organized the V-2 operations, and now sought a final legacy, a weapon that could turn physics itself into artillery. He called it the ghost shell cannon, a device so advanced it bordered on superstition, a railgun that would launch metal slugs not with powder or propellant, but with raw magnetism. The concept wasn't entirely German. Allied intelligence would later learn it was pieced together from confiscated Soviet blueprints, intercepted American patents, and sketches stolen from French universities. Somewhere in those fragments lay an idea. If electricity could propel a train, why not a bullet? To Kammler, it was destiny. To his engineers, it was suicide. They were ordered to channel 10 million volts through twin copper rails, spaced barely 5 centimeters apart. Theoretically, if the pulse was sequenced just right, the projectile would accelerate to several kilometers per second. In reality, no metal on Earth could endure that strain. The rails would melt, the field would collapse, and the entire chamber would turn into a lightning bolt in a box. But Kammler didn't care. He told his scientists, "If you can make lightning fire steel, do it before the Allies arrive." The chosen test site was a coastal bunker complex north of Peenemünde, disguised as a marine radar installation. Dozens of engineers were transferred from the V-2 program, men exhausted, half-starved, still reeking of burnt propellant. Among them was Kurt Weisner, 26 years old, formerly a railway mechanic from Bremen. His colleagues called him the listener because he could diagnose engines by ear. Now he applied that same intuition to magnetic coils, describing electric current in his notebook as a living storm looking for ground. He was brilliant but unstable, a man who believed machines had moods. The bunker became a laboratory of improvisation. They scavenged copper from torpedo factories, bearings from locomotives, and insulators from telephone lines. When asked what would happen if the timing failed, Weisner said, "Then the current will find the weakest conductor. And the weakest conductor is human flesh." His superiors ignored him. Secrecy consumed the project. The staff signed oaths binding them under threat of death. Guards patrolled every corridor. Delivery trucks arrived at night, their crates labeled agricultural equipment. Kammler visited once a week, demanding progress, threatening to replace anyone who hesitated. "The Führer will not wait for theories," he said. "He wants thunder." By September 1944, the first prototype stood ready. A steel barrel 40 feet long, wrapped in 30 magnetic rings, each linked to its own capacitor bank. The engineers nicknamed it Der Geistwerfer, the ghost thrower. Its projectile was a tungsten slug, barely the size of a wine bottle, yet the calculations claimed it could travel 20 miles in less than 3 seconds. If it worked, the Allies would never see it coming. If it failed, the explosion would wipe out the entire complex. Still, the command came down. Proceed to test. Funding poured in. More copper arrived. And deep inside the bunker, Wiesner began to prepare the coils, murmuring under his breath as he tightened each bolt, as if coaxing the storm to sleep, unaware that when it finally woke, it would consume everything around it. The construction of the ghost shell cannon was unlike any engineering project on Earth. It wasn't built, it was assembled like a confession, piece by piece, with men who no longer believed in safety, only results. Its barrel stretched across the length of the bunker, a dark corridor of steel and copper wrapped in cable thicker than a man's arm. The walls glowed faintly from the static charge that never seemed to dissipate. The weapon's body was a series of tungsten steel segments, each one weighing several tons, connected end to end with copper-lined joints. Around each segment ran a circular magnetic coil wound by hand, hundreds of turns of wire insulated with whatever the engineers could find. Rubber, varnish, even paper soaked in oil. The timing system was driven by a primitive analog computer, a table of rotating cams and brass contacts that would, in theory, trigger each coil in perfect sequence, chasing the projectile down the barrel at the speed of a thunderclap. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was hell. The test chambers reeked of ozone and scorched leather. Every time they powered a segment, sparks danced along the floor, crawling up the boots of anyone standing too close. The gauges burned out faster than they could be replaced. When the coils overloaded, the magnetic field crushed the air itself, producing a low metallic hum that made teeth ache and ears bleed. Technicians began carrying long discharge rods wherever they went. Wooden poles capped with copper hooks to drain away static arcs before they touched metal. One careless step could mean a fatal shock. The chamber's lighting flickered constantly, shadows warping like ghosts across the machinery. Wiesner's nerves began to fray. He begged Kammler for better materials, ceramic insulators, rubberized mounts, modern transformers. Kammler refused every request. "Ceramics are for radar," he snapped. "You'll use what the fatherland has left." So they made do with asbestos sheets salvaged from shipyards, wrapping the coils like bandages on a dying patient. For coolant, they redirected pipes from a decommissioned U-boat, pumping seawater straight through the magnetic housings. It hissed and steamed, corroding the copper from within. Each night, Wiesner returned to his cot in the control bunker and wrote in a small leather notebook. The entries grew stranger with time, half physics, half poetry. Current hums when it's hungry. The rails want to breathe. If all coils ignite together, the current will seek the weakest heart, ours. The other engineers read his notes in silence. No one laughed anymore. By September 1944, the prototype stood complete. 65 feet long, 200 tons of magnetized ambition. To power it, they constructed a diesel-driven generator array beside the bunker, an interconnected maze of pistons and flywheels capable of producing enough voltage to black out an entire province. When they ran the system for the first time, the lights flickered from Stettin to Peenemünde. Guards began calling it Der Donnerstab, the thunder rod. The name stuck. They said, when you touched the barrel, your fingers tingled for minutes afterward, as if the weapon had a pulse. To the SS command, it was the future of artillery. To the scientists, it was suicide dressed in steel. One physicist compared it to putting a hurricane in a pipe. Wiesner, staring at the gleaming rails one night, whispered to his assistant, "It's beautiful, but beauty isn't meant to survive here." By the end of that week, the final cables were laid, the capacitors charged, and the test projectile, small, polished, perfectly weighted, was placed in the breech. No one dared to touch it afterward. They said the metal felt warm, as if waiting for something. All that remained was a single order from Kammler. Fire. On the morning of October 29, 1944, the Baltic sky hung low and colorless, a lid of steel pressing down on the Peenemünde coast. Rain drizzled in thin needles, hissing off the concrete bunkers, and the sea beyond groaned under an oncoming storm. Into this bleak dawn arrived Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, flanked by his entourage of SS officers and a pair of war correspondents, with motion picture cameras sealed in glass boxes. The ghost shell cannon stood before them like some ancient monument, 65 feet of metal gleaming faintly beneath tarps, its barrel pointing east toward nothing. Kammler's boots splashed through the puddles as he approached the control post, his voice slicing through the wind. "Today," he declared, "we bring thunder down to earth." The engineers, their faces pale and sleepless, lined up behind sandbag barriers. No one spoke. Even the guards, usually loud and mocking, stared at the barrel in silence. Somewhere in the distance, the gulls took flight and vanished. Inside the control bunker, Kurt Weisner moved like a man caught in a trance. His fingers trembled as he checked the capacitor banks, each dial quivering near the red line. The analog timers rotated with a slow, rhythmic click, each turn marking the approach of the impossible. "Phase 1 ready," murmured his assistant, though his voice cracked halfway through. At precisely 0900 hours, Weisner exhaled once, reached for the massive brass lever, and closed the main breaker. The effect was immediate. The entire compound shuddered as if struck by an invisible hammer. Every fluorescent tube in the bunker flashed white and died. Above ground, the sandbags jumped. A low hum began to roll through the air, deep and resonant, growing in pitch until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with it. Outside, the clouds rippled as birds rose in a panicked swarm. Static electricity crawled along the coats and helmets of every man in the yard, lifting dust and hair alike. For a moment, everyone simply froze. Then came the whine, a thin, needling sound that grew sharper with every heartbeat. It rose past the point of comfort, past the point of hearing, until the glass in the bunker began to quiver. Weisner's hand hovered over the secondary switch. Kammler gave a single nod from the viewing trench. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. What followed was not sound. It was light. A blinding magnesium white flash filled the entire horizon, swallowing shadow, shape, and sanity in an instant. The air convulsed. The ground rose. The railgun's coils did not launch their projectile. They fused into one molten vein of copper and steel. The magnetic field reversed polarity, forcing the current back through the generator array. Every volt of stored energy came roaring backward like a tidal wave of fire. The control panels erupted in sparks. Men screamed as arcs of electricity danced from the floor to the ceiling, cutting through uniforms and flesh. For half a second, witnesses said, the ghost shell cannon shone brighter than the sun. Its frame became a pillar of living lightning, a blinding column that split the clouds and illuminated the Baltic coast for miles. And then it detonated. The explosion tore through concrete bunkers like paper. Steel doors twisted. Windows 50 meters away shattered. Kammler's men were thrown like rag dolls across the courtyard, their cameras tumbling end over end into the mud. Weisner felt himself lifted from the ground, his ears imploding from the shock wave. When he hit the floor again, his vision was white and ringing. Smoke poured into the control room, thick with the scent of ozone, diesel, and burning hair. He clawed his way toward the open hatch and stumbled out into the storm. The cannon was gone. Only a warped skeleton remained. A crescent of glowing metal bent backward, as if it had tried to recoil from its own birth. The earth around it was scorched black. The sand turned to glass. Across the yard, officers staggered to their feet. One shouted for the medics, another for Kammler, whose coat was torn and face smeared with soot. The only sound was the steady hiss of rain on molten steel. A few cameramen, dazed but alive, retrieved what was left of their film reels. Kammler saw them and snapped, "Destroy it! All of it!" They obeyed immediately, burning most of the reels on the spot. But one fragment escaped, just a few frames later recovered by Allied intelligence. It showed the cannon's silhouette, a halo of light expanding behind it, and a single figure running toward the camera before the image dissolved into pure white. That was all that remained of Project Eisenfaust, the moment when man tried to aim lightning, and lightning aimed back. By nightfall, the coast around Peenemünde had become a graveyard of twisted iron and ash. Rain fell harder now, sweeping the smoke into low black clouds that refused to move. The air tasted metallic, heavy with the aftershock of ozone and diesel. By order of the SS, no one outside the base was to know what had happened. Trucks sealed off the roads, while armed guards turned away every civilian within miles. Floodlights snapped on over the crater where the ghost shell cannon had once stood, illuminating a scene that looked less like a test site and more like a meteor impact. Recovery teams in rubber gloves picked their way through the rubble, collecting melted copper and shards of fused tungsten by hand. Each fragment still warm, each one humming faintly. The pieces were sealed in lead-lined boxes and stacked like coffins along the bunker wall. Kammler arrived hours later in a new uniform, his face unreadable, and barked orders to his adjutant. All notes, all film, all personnel reports, classified under E-Weapons Division Failure Protocol. That phrase alone meant the event would vanish into bureaucracy before morning. Officially, nothing had ever existed. Dozens of the wounded were quietly removed under tarps, their burns so severe their features were unrecognizable. Most were declared killed in action and reassigned posthumously to distant fronts to erase the evidence of their presence. Others, those who had seen too much, were shipped out alive but under false identities, absorbed into phantom units on the Eastern Front where they would conveniently disappear. Kurt Weissner was among the few spared immediate transfer. Found unconscious beside the generator housing, his face blistered and his hands charred, he was dragged into a makeshift infirmary and revived only to be questioned. For 3 days he was interrogated by SS intelligence officers under blinding lamps, his burns oozing through the bandages. He told them again and again that the coils had mistimed by milliseconds, that a single delay in the analog sequence had caused the current to reverse and implode the magnetic field. But the investigators didn't care for physics. They wanted culprits. His report was dismissed as imaginative distortion under trauma. Instead, they blamed sabotage. Within a week, 3 technicians who had worked the timing system were arrested and never seen again. Meanwhile, investigators combing through the wreckage uncovered something that unnerved even the most hardened officers. A perfect circular scorch pattern fused into the concrete floor where the cannon had once been anchored. The center was glassy and smooth, as if melted by lightning, but around it radiated faint concentric rings of magnetized dust that caused compasses to spin uncontrollably. Instruments failed within meters of the mark. When one officer attempted to drive an iron stake into the pattern, the hammer's head flew off as if repelled. Scientists recorded abnormal readings, then abruptly stopped taking notes when Kammler appeared and ordered the site sealed. Yet the whispers continued. Guards reported that even days later, their skin tingled when they stood too close. The local fishermen in the nearby village claimed the night sky had glowed green for hours after the explosion, a shimmering aurora that faded only with the dawn. No official explanation was ever given, and anyone caught discussing it was reassigned or worse. In the weeks that followed, the SS dismantled what little remained of the Ghost Shell project. The bunker was stripped of wiring, the floors repoured, and the surviving components loaded onto 6 freight wagons bound supposedly for an Alpine depot in Bavaria. Each crate was labeled as industrial transformer equipment and accompanied by a sealed order signed personally by Kammler. Somewhere south of Berlin, the train vanished from all records. No arrival logs, no witnesses, no surviving manifests, only a single line in a transport ledger marked "Diverted under emergency authority." Historians later searched for evidence of the depot and found nothing. No coordinates, no building, not even a foundation. It was as if the train had been swallowed by the war itself. By December, all personnel associated with Project Eisenfaust were reassigned or declared missing. And so the ghost shell cannon was buried, not only in rubble, but in paperwork and fear. Official communiqué referred to it only as Incident 47B. No one outside the SS hierarchy ever heard of it again. To the men who survived, it became a forbidden memory, one they were never allowed to acknowledge. one they carried like a burn under their skin. In the Reich's final months, as cities fell and documents burned, the name ghost shell disappeared completely from German records. Yet among the survivors, a quiet saying lingered in whispers. The day we tried to fire thunder, the thunder fired back. When the war finally ended, and the black flags of the Reich were torn down, the Allies descended upon Peenemünde like archaeologists sifting through the bones of a dead civilization. What they found there was more unsettling than ruins. Inside collapsed hangars and shattered bunkers lay the remnants of machines that shouldn't have existed in 1944. Burned-out turbines, half-melted generators, fragments of copper rails fused into shapes that looked more like sculpture than science. Among those fragments were twisted coils from the ghost shell cannon, their surfaces glassy, smooth, and strangely iridescent, as if the metal itself had been turned liquid and refrozen mid-explosion. American intelligence officers, operating under Operation Paperclip, quietly crated up the material and shipped it westward for analysis. In laboratories at Los Alamos, physicists placed the pieces under microscopes and were baffled. One of them scribbled a single line in the report margin: magnetic saturation beyond theoretical limit. Composition unknown. The alloy behaved like both metal and ceramic, neither conducting nor insulating properly. A paradox trapped in steel. The Allied scientists disagreed on what exactly had happened that October morning. Some argued that, for a brief instant, the Germans had achieved true plasma acceleration. A railgun decades ahead of its time, capable of creating a self-sustaining electromagnetic field. To them, the explosion wasn't a failure, but a success that the materials of 1944 simply couldn't contain. Others dismissed it entirely, calling it a glorified short circuit, a catastrophic misfire of bad timing and worse luck. Still, the data refused to die. Reports circulated quietly through American and British research divisions, always with the same warning attached: caution, unknown resonance effects. By the early 1950s, British declassified memos began to surface under the codename E-Device Type 5, described dryly as a linear, magnetic projectile system abandoned after catastrophic field collapse. Those words, identical to Wisner's own wartime phrasing, confirmed that at least someone in the West had tried to resurrect the design. In 1956, a U.S. naval researcher at Dahlgren reportedly constructed a small-scale coil array based on notes recovered from Peenemünde. He never published the results, but witnesses later recalled the test chamber exploding seconds after ignition. The scientist survived, but lost the hearing in both ears. His debriefing report was sealed under the classification Briggs-Wisner pattern. The name had fused two histories, one American, one German, both bound by the same impossible experiment. Even in failure, the ghost shell cannon refused to vanish. Its influence echoed through the Cold War era of experimental weapons. Engineers studying electromagnetic propulsion cited the Peenemünde data as a primitive precedent. Physicists working on particle accelerators noticed eerie similarities between Wisner's coil timing models and modern synchrotron principles. Even early mass driver sketches from the 1970s borrowed its sequential magnet geometry, as if some ghost of the design had seeped into human progress itself. The paradox was hauntingly consistent. The idea had been sound. The world simply wasn't ready for it. In retrospect, scientists agreed that the Germans had brushed against something fundamental: the threshold where electricity ceases to be a tool and becomes a living force. Their coils had turned fields into flame, their rails into lightning. They had tried to wield thunder before they understood how to hold it. And somewhere in the melted remnants stored in classified archives, those dull black spirals of fused copper and tungsten, there remained the faint magnetic echo of that impossible moment when man's ambition outpaced the metals that carried it. Kurt Wisner lived, but not as the same man who had walked into the bunker that morning in 1944. When investigators released him after weeks of silence and suspicion, he drifted through the rubble of post-war Germany like a ghost among ruins. The burns on his hands never fully healed. Thin white arcs crossed his palms like lightning scars, the skin there forever cold to the touch. By 1951, Allied intelligence files list him only as civilian technician, Hamburg shipyards, repairing diesel generators for fishing vessels. He refused interviews, refused money, refused recognition. When fellow engineers asked what really happened at Peenemünde, he would tighten a bolt, stare at the floor, and say quietly, "It fired once." Inward. Those who worked beside him swore that sometimes, when the generators started, he would flinch at the sound, because the first cough of current always reminded him of thunder. Historians piece the story together decades later from fragments, smuggled notes, interrogation transcripts, a half-destroyed film reel recovered from an SS archive in Thuringia. The consensus was chilling. The ghost shell cannon never fired a projectile, yet it had fulfilled its purpose in a darker sense. It proved that blind faith in science, stripped of humility, can be more destructive than any enemy weapon. The SS had built a god of magnetism and asked it for victory. What they received was judgment. Hans Kammler, the architect of the Reich's secret programs, vanished months after the explosion. Some records claim he ordered the project moved to the Austrian Alps. Others say he fled with the blueprints and died in the mountains. No body was ever found. To this day, declassified Allied reports end his file with a single word: missing. In the 1970s, Baltic divers exploring near the Peenemünde test range stumbled upon twisted bands of metal buried deep in the silt, curved like the ribs of a leviathan. When they lifted them to the surface, their compasses spun uselessly. Laboratory analysis showed residual magnetism far stronger than any ordinary alloy should retain after 7 decades underwater. The samples still hummed faintly when exposed to electrical current, as if remembering the voltage that had once torn through them. Engineers called the phenomenon impossible. Physicists called it coincidence. The divers called it cursed. Yet everyone who touched those fragments claimed to feel a vibration, tiny, steady, like a living pulse trapped inside the steel. In the years that followed, the ghost shell cannon passed from classified report to legend. Among post-war scientists, it became shorthand for hubris, the invention that fired before it fired. University lecturers used it as a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, and defense engineers quietly referenced its name whenever a new experiment began to flirt with instability. It was no longer a weapon, but a parable, a reminder that brilliance without restraint invites its own destruction. Wisner's name faded from textbooks, yet his story survived in whispers, carried by those who had seen too much power in too small a room. One historian summed it up best in a margin note found beside an old photograph of the ruins. In the dying months of the Reich, the Schutzstaffel tried to bottle lightning. They succeeded for half a heartbeat, and that heartbeat cost them everything. And so, the ghost shell's legacy endures, not in victories or schematics, but in the faint magnetic memory of metal that once tried to contain a storm. A reminder that some inventions are never truly lost. They simply wait for someone reckless enough to listen again. The ghost shell cannon was never rebuilt, never tested again, and never officially acknowledged. The blueprints vanished, the witnesses scattered, and the archives burned. What remained were only melted rails and myths, traces of a weapon that tried to summon thunder and paid the price. Yet even myths leave a shadow, and this one lingers like static in the air, humming faintly whenever man's ambition dares to outpace his understanding. If you believe forgotten inventions deserve to be remembered, subscribe for more untold stories of World War II. Hidden experiments, the machines that failed, but changed history anyway. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments below, and share which secret project you think was real. Because sometimes the most powerful weapons of war never worked at all.